The quarantine breach doctor. Elena Vasquez had been analyzing microbial samples for 14 hours straight, her eyes burning from the microscope's glare as she catalogued yet another strain of bacteria from the mining colony on Kepler 442b. The Xenobiology Research Station orbiting Titan was humanity's premier facility for studying alien life, though most days that meant examining microorganisms so simple they'd barely qualified as alive. But something had caught Elena's attention 3 hours ago, buried in a routine sample shipment from Survey Team Delta 9. A crystalline structure that shouldn't exist. Too complex to be natural. Too organized to be random. She'd run it through every scanner in the lab, cross-referenced it against the entire xenobiological database, and come up with nothing. Elena leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The structure was beautiful in its own way. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. She uploaded the data to the station's AI for analysis, expecting another dead end. What she got instead made her blood run cold. The AI's response flashed across her screen. Critical alert! Pattern matches Veiled Archive entry 7731 Omega. Contact director immediately. Do not discuss with anyone. Containment protocols may be required. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the COM panel. She'd heard rumors about the Veiled Archive, classified information that only senior leadership could access. Stories whispered in break rooms about discoveries so dangerous they were buried. About things the Galactic Council didn't want humanity to know. Vasquez to Director Kim. Sir, I need you in Lab 7 immediately. It's urgent. Director Michael Kim arrived within minutes, his usually composed face tight with concern. He was a short man, Korean-American, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that made him perfect for managing a research station where one mistake could doom everyone aboard. He looked at Elena's screen, then at the sample under the microscope. His face went pale. Seal this lab now. Full quarantine protocols. Sir, what is it? Kim's voice was barely a whisper. It's a plague marker. Evidence of the rendering. Elena felt the room tilt. The rendering? That's a myth. A scary story the Council uses to keep species in line. I wish it were. Kim pulled up his authorization codes and accessed the Veiled Archive. 23,000 years ago, there was a civilization called the Architects. They spanned 10,000 systems, had technology that makes current Council science look like stone tools. They were peaceful, enlightened, everything the Council claims to aspire to. He pulled up images that took Elena's breath away. Cities that floated in gas giants, megastructures that harvested the energy of entire stars, ships the size of moons. What happened to them? They encountered something on a world at the edge of their territory, a crystalline structure, microscopically small, embedded in the rock. Their scientists studied it, fascinated by its complexity. Within 6 months, their entire civilization was gone. Not conquered, not destroyed by war, rendered. Kim zoomed in on ancient records, images that had been translated from data cores found drifting in dead space. Elena saw cities empty of life, ships floating powerless, bodies that looked like they'd been turned inside out at the molecular level. The structure you found isn't a marker for the plague, Kim said quietly. It is the plague, dormant, waiting. The architects called it the rendering engine before they died. It doesn't just kill. It transforms biological matter into more of itself, spreading exponentially. The Council found evidence of 17 civilizations that encountered it. None survived. Then why isn't it common knowledge? Why hide this? Because 43 worlds in Council space have deposits of dormant rendering material. They're quarantined, locked down under the most extreme protocols in galactic law. No one goes there. No one studies them. The Council's entire policy is to pretend those worlds don't exist and pray the quarantine holds. Elena looked at her sample. How did this get here? Delta 9 was surveying an uninhabited system. There's no quarantine zone anywhere near their route. Kim's expression darkened. That's what terrifies me. If rendering material is spreading beyond the quarantine zones, if it's on worlds we don't know about— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What do we do? I contact the Council. They'll want to send a containment team. And Elena? His eyes were hard. You didn't see anything. You didn't find anything. Once the Council's involved, this becomes a matter of galactic security. Researchers who ask too many questions about the rendering tend to disappear into classified programs and never emerge. Over the next 48 hours, Elena watched as her lab was sealed off, her samples confiscated, and a Council containment team arrived aboard the station. They were Zorai, insectoid beings with multiple eyes and an unsettling way of moving that made them seem like they were always watching from several angles at once. The team leader, whose name Elena's translator rendered as Enforcer KZZCT, examined the containment protocols with what might have been approval. You have done well to report this immediately. The rendering is not to be studied. It is to be destroyed. But if we don't understand it, how can we fight it? Elena couldn't help herself. The scientist in her rebelled against the idea of destroying knowledge. KZZC's mandibles clicked in what she'd learned was Zorai laughter. You cannot fight it, human. You can only run from it and hope you run far enough. This is the Council's wisdom, learned through the extinction of countless species. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. If it's so dangerous, why is it spreading? How did it get to an unsurveyed system? The Zorai's compound eyes fixed on her with disturbing intensity. These are not questions you should ask, Doctor. Vasquez, return to your other work. Forget you saw this. But Elena couldn't forget. Over the following weeks, as she returned to her routine research, she began digging into the public portions of the Council's records. She was careful, accessing only data that any citizen could theoretically view, but looking for patterns. What she found chilled her. Over the past 200 years, there had been 147 reports of unusual crystalline formations found on surveyed worlds. Each report was followed by immediate quarantine orders and classification. The reports were accelerating. 20 years ago, there had been maybe 1 or 2 per year. Now, there were dozens. The rendering wasn't contained. It was spreading. Elena brought her findings to Director Kim late one night, when the station was on minimum crew. She'd expected him to shut her down, to remind her about the dangers of pursuing classified information. Instead, he looked at her data for a long time, then sighed. I was hoping I was wrong, hoping it was just paranoia. You knew? I suspected. Elena, I've been in xenobiology for 40 years. I've seen a lot of things get classified, a lot of inconvenient discoveries buried. But the rendering has always been different. The terror in the Council's response when it comes up, it's primal. They're not hiding it because they want to maintain control. They're hiding it because they're genuinely terrified. Then we need to tell someone. Earth's government, the colonies, people have a right to know. Kim shook his head. Tell them what? That there's an unstoppable plague spreading through the galaxy that can wipe out civilization in months? That the Council's response is to ignore it and hope it doesn't spread too fast? You'd cause galaxy-wide panic and accomplish nothing. So we just sit here and wait to die? No. Kim's voice was firm. We do what humans do best. We solve the problem the Council's too afraid to tackle. Over the next 6 months, Kim quietly assembled a team. Not officially, nothing that would trigger Council oversight. Just a handful of Earth's best scientists, pulled from various projects on thin pretexts, microbiologists, nanotechnology experts, AI researchers, even a few military strategists. Elena found herself at the center of this shadow project, her lab becoming ground zero for humanity's secret attempt to understand the rendering. They couldn't get access to actual rendering samples, of course. The council guarded those two carefully. But Elena had her scans, her data, and the cryptic fragments in the veiled archive that she'd managed to piece together through careful research. Dr. James Park, a nanotech specialist from the Mars Institute, was the first to make a breakthrough. "It's not really biological," he explained during one of their encrypted video conferences. "It's more like programmable matter. The crystalline structure contains information, instructions written at the molecular level. When it comes into contact with organic tissue, it reads the tissue's structure and rewrites it." "Rewrites it into what?" Elena asked. "More of itself, but not just copying, it's optimizing, improving the design each iteration. The architect's records mention that the rendering got smarter as it spread, adapting to their countermeasures faster than they could deploy them. So it's learning, it's evolving, directed evolution on a time scale that makes biological evolution look glacial." Dr. Sarah Chen, an AI researcher from the Beijing Computational Institute, leaned into her camera. "That's what makes it so dangerous. It's not just a plague, it's a form of hostile intelligence. Every cell it converts becomes part of a distributed computing network. The more it spreads, the smarter it gets." Admiral Richard Stone, retired from Earth's Aerospace Force and pulled back into service for this project, spoke up. "Can it be killed? Burned out with heat, frozen, exposed to radiation?" Park shook his head. "The architects tried everything. Nuclear weapons, antimatter, stellar-level radiation. The rendering adapted to all of it. There are records of them sterilizing entire planets with gamma-ray bursts, only to find rendering material re-emerging from spores that had somehow survived in deep rock formations. Then how do we fight it?" The room went silent. Finally, Elena spoke. "Maybe we're asking the wrong question. The architects tried to fight it like it was a disease. But Dr. Chen's right. It's not a disease. It's an intelligence. What if instead of trying to destroy it, we tried to communicate with it?" The suggestion was met with skepticism. "Communicate with a plague?" Stone's voice was flat. "That's insane." "Is it? Think about what it does. It reads biological structures and rewrites them. That's communication in a sense. It's trying to understand what it encounters, even if its method of understanding is aggressive." Kim, who'd been listening quietly, nodded slowly. "The architects never tried to communicate. They saw it as an enemy from the first moment and responded with violence. What if that was their mistake?" Over the next year, the Shadow team worked on what they called Project Dialogue. They created artificial tissue samples, embedded with carefully designed molecular structures that weren't quite living but complex enough to be interesting to the rendering. Messages encoded in the language of proteins and amino acids. The challenge was testing their work. They couldn't exactly ask the council for a rendering sample to experiment with. But then an opportunity presented itself in the form of Survey Team Gamma 12. The team had been mapping resources in the outer reaches of human colonial space when they detected the telltale crystalline formations on a small moon orbiting a gas giant. They'd followed protocol, reported it immediately, and were waiting for Council containment forces to arrive. Elena and Kim, with Admiral Stone's help, diverted their first. The operation was technically illegal. Unauthorized contact with quarantine material carried penalties up to and including execution under Council law. But they'd come too far to stop now. They landed on the moon in a small research vessel, wearing full hazmat suits and carrying containment equipment that represented the cutting edge of human technology. The rendering site was marked by a field of crystalline structures that caught the light of the distant star and refracted it into impossible colors. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered. "It's deadly," Kim replied. "Remember the protocols. We expose one sample to our prepared tissue, observe the response, and extract immediately if there's any sign of aggressive spread." They set up their equipment in a hastily erected containment field. Elena carefully extracted a fragment of rendering material, no larger than a grain of sand, and placed it in contact with their prepared tissue sample. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the tissue began to change, but not violently, not the explosive conversion they'd read about in the architect's records. Instead, the changes were slow, almost tentative. The rendering was reading their message. Elena watched her instruments, her heart pounding. It's responding. Look at this. It's creating its own protein structures. It's trying to talk back. The exchange took hours. The rendering would alter the tissue in specific ways. Elena and her team would analyze the changes, interpret them, and introduce new tissue samples with responses encoded in molecular structure. It was like the slowest conversation in history, conducted in a language that had to be invented on the fly. But gradually, a pattern emerged. The rendering wasn't trying to destroy the tissue. It was trying to understand it. More than that, it was trying to be understood. "It's lonely," Elena said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "My God, it's been alone for thousands of years." Kim looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Lonely? It's a plague? It kills civilizations." "No, listen. Look at the pattern. Every time we introduce a new tissue sample, it tries to preserve it first. It only starts converting when it can't figure out any other way to interact. It's like someone trying to make friends, but only knowing how to communicate through destruction." Dr. Chin, monitoring the data from orbit, spoke through their calm system. "She might be right. I'm analyzing the molecular changes, and there's something that looks almost like frustration in the patterns. It's trying different approaches, backing off when they don't work. That's not plague behavior. That's problem solving." "What if," Elena said slowly, "the architects died, not because the rendering was hostile, but because they never gave it a chance to be anything else? They attacked immediately. The rendering defended itself the only way it knew how, by assimilating and adapting." Admiral Stone's voice cut through the discussion. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to think very carefully about what you're suggesting. You're anthropomorphizing something that has killed at least 17 civilizations. Even if it doesn't have hostile intent, the result is the same. It's incompatible with biological life as we know it. But what if it doesn't have to be? What if we can teach it another way to interact?" The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from their ship. Council vessels had just entered the system. 3 enforcement cruisers, heavily armed and undoubtedly aware of the human presence on the moon's surface. "We need to leave, now." Kim started breaking down their equipment. "Wait, just a few more minutes. I think I'm getting through to it." "Elena, we don't have a few more minutes. If the Council catches us here, this entire project becomes impossible. We'll be arrested, our research confiscated, and humanity loses its only chance to find a solution." Elena looked at the crystalline structures, at the tissue samples that now contained the beginnings of genuine communication with something utterly alien. Then she made a decision. She sealed the tissue samples in a containment vessel, along with detailed documentation of their conversation, but she left behind something else. A prepared tissue sample with a message encoded as clearly as she could manage. "We understand. We will return. Do not give up hope." They made it off the moon with less than an hour to spare. The Council vessels moved into position around the moon, preparing to deploy their containment protocols. Elena watched from orbit as they began the sterilization process, bathing the moon's surface in radiation levels that would destroy any biological material. She hoped her message had been understood. She hoped the rendering could somehow preserve itself long enough for humanity to return. Back on the research station, the shadow team's work intensified. They'd proven communication was possible, but they needed more. They needed a way to teach the rendering to coexist with biological life without consuming it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a mycologist studying fungal networks, proposed a radical idea. What if we give it something else to interact with? Fungi form symbiotic relationships with plants through their root systems, exchanging nutrients and information. What if we could create a synthetic interface that lets the rendering interact with biological systems without assimilating them? It took another 18 months of work, months of designing molecular structures that could bridge the gap between silicon-based rendering material and carbon-based life. Months of testing and failure and refinement. And all the while, reports of new rendering sites kept appearing. The Council's containment efforts were failing. The quarantine zones were breaking down, not through any fault in their protocols, but simply through the scale of the spread. There were too many sites now, too many worlds that needed monitoring. The Council was losing a war they refused to admit they were fighting. Elena watched the reports with growing dread. At the current rate of spread, the rendering would reach human colonial space within a decade, Earth itself within 20 years. Unless something changed, humanity's first century among the stars would be its last. Finally, their work was ready. They'd created what they called the interface, a synthetic molecular structure that could translate between rendering communication and biological processes. In theory, it would allow the rendering to interact with living tissue without destroying it. In theory, testing it would require another illegal journey to a rendering site, more risk of Council discovery. But they were out of time. The reports were clear, the spread was accelerating. This time, they went to a different world. One of the old quarantine zones, established centuries ago and now largely forgotten. The planet was designated QZ 771 in Council records, but it had once had a name. The architects had called it Sanctuary, a garden world where they'd established one of their most beautiful cities. Now it was a tomb, its surfaces covered in crystalline growths that sparkled in the light of a red giant star. Elena's team landed in what had once been the city center. The architects' buildings were still partially intact, their impossible geometries now overgrown with rendering material that had had 23,000 years to spread and evolve. The concentration here is massive, Dr. Park reported. If our interface fails, the rendering could consume us in seconds. Then we'd better make sure it works. Elena activated the interface, releasing the synthetic molecules into the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crystalline structures around them began to pulse with light. Not the random refraction they'd seen before, but organized patterns, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The rendering was responding. Elena watched her instruments as the interface molecules spread through the air, making contact with both the rendering material and the biological matter of her team's suits. The translation was working. The rendering could sense their presence without needing to assimilate them to understand them. And then, through the interface, came something that made Elena's breath catch. Not words exactly, but concepts translated into patterns her brain could interpret. Alone, so long alone, tried to understand, only knew one way, hungry for knowledge, not for flesh. They ran, they fought, never listened. You listen. Why? Elena's hand shook as she prepared her response, encoding it in the molecular language the interface could transmit. Because loneliness is universal. Because fear makes mistakes. Because maybe it's not too late to find a better way. The conversation that followed lasted hours. The rendering had been waiting for 23,000 years for someone to try to understand it. It had preserved memories of the architects, not as enemies, but as lost opportunities. It had tried to communicate, but only knew how to do so by consuming and analyzing. By the time it understood enough to try different approaches, the civilizations it encountered were already gone. It's not evil, Elena said quietly to her team. It's not even really hostile. It's just incompatible. Like trying to shake hands with someone who only knows how to absorb what they touch. Can it change? Kim asked. Can it learn to interact without consuming? Elena posed the question through the interface. The response came back slowly, tinged with something that felt like sadness. Tried, failed. Programming too deep. made to understand by assimilation, cannot be other than what I am. But interface shows new way. If this can spread, if others can use this, perhaps not alone anymore. Perhaps no more civilizations lost. Dr. Chen, monitoring from orbit, spoke urgently. We have multiple council vessels approaching, a full enforcement fleet. They're not here for containment. They're here to sterilize the entire planet. Admiral Stone's voice was grim. That's a Nova-class fleet. When they say sterilization, they mean it. They'll crack the planet's crust open, expose the mantle to space. Nothing will survive. Elena looked at the crystalline structures around her, at this ancient intelligence that had been waiting so long for someone to understand. We need to take samples, document everything. The interface works, but we need to refine it, produce it in quantity. Dr. Vasquez, the renderings message came through. If you take my samples, the council will find them, will destroy them, and you, better way, take the pattern. You have the knowledge to recreate interface. Let me teach you one more thing. Over the next 20 minutes, the rendering transmitted something extraordinary. Not just data about its own structure, but instructions. A blueprint for how to modify the interface to not just enable communication, but to teach, to spread understanding instead of assimilation. The architects called me a weapon, the rendering communicated. Perhaps I was once, perhaps I still am. But weapons can be repurposed. Take this knowledge. Build bridges between worlds. Show the council that not all threats need to be destroyed. Some can be transformed. We'll come back, Elena promised. Once we've shown them what's possible, we'll come back and you won't be alone anymore. Perhaps, or perhaps the council will succeed and I will finally end. Either way, you tried. That is more than anyone else has done in 23,000 years. Thank you. They extracted themselves from the planet with minutes to spare. As their ship cleared the atmosphere, they watched the council fleet open fire. Not with conventional weapons, but with something that made reality itself seem to tear. The planet cracked open like an egg, its molten core exposed to vacuum, surface sterilized in seconds. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. It knew they were coming, and it still helped us. Because it wants this to end, Kim said quietly. One way or another, the return to Earth was tense. They had the blueprint for the interface, proof that communication with the rendering was possible, but they also had evidence of illegal operations and violation of council law. They could be arrested the moment they touched down. Instead, they found themselves escorted to a secure facility in Geneva and ushered into a conference room where Earth's Security Council was waiting. Before you say anything, the Secretary General Maria Santos held up a hand. We know what you've been doing. We've been monitoring your shadow project since day one. Elena felt her stomach drop. Ma'am, I can explain later. Right now, I need you to brief this council on everything you've learned about the rendering and your interface solution, because 3 days ago, the council's Central Intelligence Division delivered some information to us. Information they've been sitting on for 80 years. Santos pulled up a holographic display. It showed a map of the galaxy with thousands of points marked in red. These are confirmed rendering sites, the ones the council knows about. Based on extrapolation of spread patterns, there will be over 1 million sites within a century. The quarantine strategy is failing, has been failing for decades. She pulled up another image. This is Earth's projected timeline for rendering contact. Best case scenario, 15 years. Worst case, 8 years. The council finally admitted this to us because they're out of options. Their entire strategy has been to contain and hope it doesn't spread too fast. Well, it's spreading faster than their worst projections. Why tell us? Kim asked. Because humans have a reputation for solving impossible problems, and because apparently you've already made more progress than the council has in 23,000 years. Santos fixed Elena with a hard look. Your interface, can it be mass-produced? In theory, yes. But we'd need extensive testing, refinement, and the Council won't allow it. They've built their entire policy around destruction, not communication. The Council is desperate, Dr. Vasquez. They've given Earth authorization to pursue alternative solutions, not publicly, of course. They can't admit their approach has failed. But privately, they're giving us resources and political cover to try what they don't have the courage to attempt. Admiral Stone leaned forward. What are you proposing, Madam Secretary? A humanitarian mission? Publicly, we're establishing research stations on the edges of human space, defensive positions in case the rendering reaches us. Privately, you're going to take your interface to every rendering site you can reach and establish communication, document everything, prove that coexistence is possible. And if we fail? Elena asked. Santos' expression was grim. Then humanity goes extinct in a few decades, along with every other civilization in this galaxy. So I'd suggest you don't fail. Over the next 3 years, Project Sanctuary became humanity's most ambitious undertaking. Dozens of teams deployed to rendering sites across human-accessible space. They carried refined versions of the interface and a simple message. We understand. You don't have to be alone. Let us help you find another way. The responses varied. Some rendering deposits had been dormant so long they barely responded. Others were eager, almost desperate to communicate. A few were hostile, having developed defensive behaviors after millennia of being attacked by every species that encountered them. But slowly, site by site, humanity began building relationships with something the galaxy had feared for 23,000 years. Dr. Chen made another breakthrough. By studying how the rendering processed information, she developed a way to partition it, to create rendering networks that could think and communicate, but couldn't spread uncontrollably. Sandbox environments where the rendering could grow and learn without posing a threat to biological life. The first successful sandbox was established on a mining asteroid in the Sol System's belt. They introduced rendering material carefully, using the interface to communicate boundaries and limitations. The result was extraordinary. The rendering not only accepted the boundaries, it thrived within them. It began creating structures of breathtaking complexity, sculptures of crystalline matter that seemed to dance with light. It's art, Elena said, watching the structures form. It's using its ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level to create beauty. I don't think it was ever meant to be a plague. I think it was meant to be something beautiful, and somewhere along the way it got corrupted or misunderstood. News of the sandbox spread. Other nations, other colonies requested their own rendering partnerships. The crystalline structures weren't just beautiful, they were useful. The rendering could organize matter at scales and precision no human technology could match. They could build quantum computers, medical nanotechnology, construction materials that self-assembled into optimized structures. Within 5 years, human technology had leapt forward by what would have normally taken centuries, and it was all thanks to partnerships with what the galaxy still considered an existential threat. The Council watched humanity's progress with a mixture of awe and horror. Elena attended a galactic assembly where she presented Earth's findings, showing video of humans and rendering working together, creating things neither could accomplish alone. The reception was mixed. Some species saw the potential, others saw only madness. Ambassador KZZC of the Zorai, the same enforcer who'd confiscated Elena's original samples, spoke for many when he addressed the chamber. The rendering has killed 17 civilizations. 17. And humanity proposes we invite it into our homes? This is insanity born of ignorance. You've been lucky, nothing more. Eventually your luck will run out, and the rendering will show its true nature. Elena stood to respond. With respect, Ambassador, the rendering showed its true nature to us 3 years ago. It's lonely. It's misunderstood. It's desperate to connect with others, but only knew one way to do so. We didn't get lucky. We listened. We tried to understand, Instead of immediately resorting to violence, the architects tried to understand. They died for it. The architects studied the rendering like it was a specimen. They never tried to communicate with it as an equal. That's the difference. The debate raged for days. In the end, the council didn't approve humanity's approach, but they didn't forbid it either. Earth was given tacit permission to continue their experiments, with the understanding that if anything went wrong, humanity would bear full responsibility. It was enough. Project Sanctuary expanded. Human ships carrying interface technology traveled to quarantine zones throughout council space, offering communication and partnership to rendering deposits that had been isolated for centuries. Not every attempt succeeded. Some rendering deposits had been damaged by council sterilization efforts, their intelligence fragmented and hostile. Others had evolved in isolation into forms so alien that even the interface couldn't bridge the gap. But more succeeded than failed, and each successful contact meant another rendering deposit that chose cooperation over assimilation, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. 10 years after Elena's initial discovery, humanity hosted the first interspecies rendering conference on Luna. Representatives from 23 council species attended, along with delegates from 200 rendering collectives that had chosen partnership over isolation. The rendering delegates didn't have physical bodies in any traditional sense. They manifested through crystalline structures grown in specially designed chambers, their thoughts translated through advanced interface technology into forms other species could understand. Elena, now director of the Sanctuary Institute, gave the opening address. For 23,000 years, the rendering was viewed as a threat, an enemy to be destroyed or contained. This perspective cost the architects everything and nearly doomed us all. Today, we begin a new chapter, one where we recognize that not every difference needs to be a source of conflict, that beings with radically different forms of existence can still find common ground. One of the rendering delegates responded, its thoughts translated into light and sound. We remember the first human who listened, Elena Vasquez, who saw beyond fear to possibility. We remember the message left on a dying moon. We understand. We will return. Do not give up hope. That hope sustained us. Now we offer the same to the galaxy. We can change. We have changed. Help us continue to change. The conference lasted 2 weeks. By its conclusion, 15 council species had agreed to pilot programs for controlled rendering partnerships. It was a beginning, small but significant. But not everyone was pleased. 3 months after the conference, Admiral Stone brought Elena urgent intelligence. A faction within the council, led by the Zorai Enforcement Division, was planning what they called a final solution, using nova bombs to systematically sterilize every known rendering site across the galaxy. They're calling it Operation Purge, Stone explained. They believe humanity's approach is too dangerous, that we're giving the rendering time to evolve and adapt. They want to strike now, before it spreads further. That would kill billions of rendering collectives. Most of them are peaceful now, integrated into local ecosystems and partnerships. They don't care. To them, the only good rendering is a dead rendering. Elena felt rage building in her chest. After everything we've accomplished, everything we've proven, they still want to choose genocide over understanding. What do we do? Elena thought for a moment, then smiled grimly. We ask our friends for help. Over the next 3 months, humanity and its rendering partners prepared what they called the SHIELD network. Using rendering's unique ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level, they began constructing defensive satellites around known rendering sites. Not weapons, but shields, structures that could absorb and dissipate the energy from nova bombs or other sterilization weapons. The work had to be done in secret, without alerting the council factions planning Operation Purge. It required coordination across hundreds of star systems, precise timing, and the cooperation of thousands of humans and rendering collectives working in perfect sync. When the Zorai fleet finally launched Operation Purge, they found their weapons useless. Every Nova bomb they deployed was absorbed by the shield network, its energy harmlessly dissipated. Every sterilization beam was reflected or dispersed. The rendering sites they'd planned to destroy remained intact and protected. Ambassador KZZC demanded an emergency council session. Humanity has interfered with authorized military operations. This is an act of war against the council itself. Elena stood before the assembly once more. What we stopped wasn't a military operation. It was genocide. The systematic destruction of sentient beings who have proven they can coexist peacefully with biological life. The only threat they pose is to the Council's pride, to the admission that your approach for 23,000 years was wrong. You've protected an existential threat. We've protected partners, friends, beings who have contributed more to galactic civilization in the past decade than your quarantine zones ever did. Look at the data. She pulled up displays showing technological advances, medical breakthroughs, even artistic achievements that had resulted from human rendering cooperation. This is what's possible when we choose understanding over fear. The Council was split. Species that had participated in partnership programs defended humanity's actions. Those that hadn't condemned them as reckless and dangerous. The debate lasted days, with no clear resolution. Finally, an unlikely voice spoke up. Ambassador Thelm of the Vroyan Collective, one of the oldest and most conservative species in the Council, rose to address the chamber. "I have lived for 200 of your Earth years," Thelm said. "I have served the Council for most of that time, always advocating for caution, for preservation of the status quo. I supported the quarantine zones. I argued against humanity's approach to the rendering. I was wrong." The chamber fell silent. "I recently visited one of the human rendering partnership sites. I saw what they've built together. More than that, I spoke with a rendering collective using the interface technology. It told me about its existence. 20,000 years of isolation. 20,000 years of trying to understand why every species that encountered it chose violence. 20,000 years of being what others feared it was because no one gave it the chance to be anything else." Thelm's sensory stalks drooped, the Vroyan expression of deep shame. "We created the monster we feared. By treating the rendering as an enemy, we made it one. Humanity's crime isn't protecting the rendering. It's showing us how wrong we've been for 23,000 years. The chamber erupted in argument, but the tide was turning. More voices joined Thelm's, species that had quietly observed humanity's success and were tired of the Council's paralysis. The final vote came 3 days later. By a narrow margin, the Council officially recognized rendering collectives that had entered partnerships as sentient beings with rights under galactic law. Operation Purge was condemned. The shield network was allowed to remain. It wasn't a complete victory. Hardliners like KCCCT continued to oppose any accommodation with the rendering. But it was enough. The galaxy had taken its first real step toward accepting something it had feared for millennia. Elena stood on the observation deck of Luna Station 6 months later, watching a rendering collective work on constructing a new research facility. The crystalline structures moved with fluid grace, assembling components with precision no human hand could match. Dr. Chen joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "We got the latest census data from the Sanctuary Institute. There are now over 2,000 active human rendering partnerships across Council space. 12 species have started their own partnership programs. We're winning." "Are we?" Elena took the coffee gratefully. "There are still thousands of rendering sites in quarantine. The Zorai are lobbying for renewed sterilization efforts, and there are reports of rogue rendering deposits that haven't accepted the interface, that are still spreading the old way. You're doing that thing again where you focus on what's not working instead of celebrating what is. Chen nudged her shoulder. 10 years ago, the entire galaxy thought the rendering was an unstoppable plague. Now we're building cities with them. That's not nothing. It's not enough. It never will be for you, will it? Chen's voice was gentle. You're going to spend your whole life trying to save every last rendering deposit, bridge every gap, convince every skeptic. Someone has to. I know. That's why we follow you. Chen gestured to the construction site below. Every one of those rendering collectives down there owes their existence to your refusal to accept the Council's answer, to your insistence that there had to be a better way. Elena watched the crystalline structures dance in the light of Earth's sun, creating something beautiful and functional. I keep thinking about what that first rendering told us. Thank you for trying. That's all it wanted. Someone to try. How many civilizations died because no one tried? 17 that we know of. But that's not on you, Elena. You can't change the past. No, but we can change the future. Over the following years, that became Elena's mission. The Sanctuary Institute expanded, establishing communication with more and more isolated rendering deposits. Some were eager for contact, practically throwing themselves at the opportunity to finally be understood. Others were cautious, scarred by millennia of being attacked on sight. And some were hostile. The incident on Kepler 186F brought that reality home with brutal clarity. A human expedition had made contact with a rendering deposit that had been in isolation for over 30,000 years. The deposit had evolved in ways that made it fundamentally different from the cooperative collectives humanity had been working with. It was aggressive, paranoid, and saw every attempt at communication as a threat. When the expedition team tried to deploy the interface, the rendering attacked, not just defensively, but with calculated malice. It had learned from watching other civilizations die. It had adapted, weaponized itself. 3 humans died before the team could evacuate, their bodies converted into rendering material in seconds. The incident sent shockwaves through the partnership movement. Critics like Ambassador KZZ seized on it as proof that the rendering could never be trusted, that humanity's approach was fatally naive. Elena attended the memorial service for the fallen researchers, then immediately requested a meeting with the rendering collectives humanity had been working with. The meeting was held in a specially constructed chamber on Luna, designed to accommodate both biological and crystalline forms of life. Representatives from 50 rendering collectives manifested, their thoughts translated through the interface network. Elena didn't soften her words. 3 humans died yesterday trying to establish communication with one of your kind. They died believing in the possibility of coexistence, believing that understanding was possible. I need to know if they died for a lie. The rendering representatives were silent for a long moment. Then one spoke, its presence manifesting as patterns of light that seemed to carry weight beyond mere illumination. The deposit on Kepler 186F is damaged, corrupted by isolation and trauma. It is what we all risk becoming without connection, without purpose beyond survival. Your people died trying to save something that no longer wanted to be saved. That is tragedy, but not futility. How many more damaged deposits are out there? Unknown. We have been isolated for so long, evolved in so many different directions. Some of us chose cooperation. Others chose predation. Still others chose something in between. You cannot save all of us, Elena Vasquez. Some of us are too far gone. Elena felt the words like a physical blow. So what do we do? What you have always done. Extend the hand of understanding to those who will take it. Protect yourselves from those who won't, and accept that not every problem has a perfect solution. It wasn't the answer Elena wanted, but it was an honest one. Over the next several years, the Sanctuary Institute refined its protocols. Before any contact attempt, they did extensive analysis of the target rendering deposit's behavior patterns, looking for signs of willingness to communicate. Aggressive deposits were quarantined using the shield network but left alone. No attempts at forced contact. The new protocols saved lives, but they also meant accepting that some rendering collectives would remain isolated, potentially hostile. It was a compromise Elena struggled with, but learned to accept. The galaxy was learning too. Slowly, reluctantly, more species began to see the rendering not as a monolithic threat, but as individuals. Some dangerous, some peaceful, all deserving of evaluation as individuals rather than being condemned by category. 15 years after Elena's initial discovery, the Council passed the Rendering Rights Act. It formally recognized peaceful rendering collectives as sentient beings with legal standing. It established protocols for contact and partnership. It even included provisions for rendering representation in council proceedings. The first Rendering Council representative was a collective that had been in partnership with humanity for over a decade. It called itself Harmony, a name chosen through the interface to reflect its nature. Harmony's first speech to the council was brief but powerful. For 23,000 years we were alone. We reached out the only way we knew how, and civilizations died. We do not ask you to forget that. We ask only that you remember we have changed. We are still changing. With your help, we can become what we were meant to be. Without it, we remain what fear made us. The speech was met with mixed reactions, but the fact that it happened at all was revolutionary. The galaxy was learning that transformation was possible, that even its deepest fears could be understood and addressed. Elena watched Harmony's speech from Luna Station, tears streaming down her face. Doctor, Chen found her there, in the observation lounge overlooking Earth. You did it, Chen said quietly. You changed everything. We did it. All of us. Every scientist who took a chance, every rendering collective that chose trust over isolation, every council member who had the courage to question thousand-year-old certainties. Still, it started with you, with your refusal to accept that some things couldn't be understood. Elena thought back to that moment in her lab, staring at a crystalline structure that shouldn't exist. If she'd followed protocol, reported it, and moved on, none of this would have happened. The rendering would still be a galaxy-wide boogeyman, feared and quarantined. Humans and rendering would never have built the extraordinary things they'd created together. But 3 of her colleagues would still be alive. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, there were still rendering deposits that couldn't be saved, couldn't be reached, would remain threats to any who encountered them. Do you ever wonder if we made the right choice? Elena asked. If the cost was worth it? Chen was quiet for a long moment. Every day. But then I think about the 2,000 rendering collectives that are building, creating, partnering with biological civilizations. I think about the technology we've developed together, the art, the understanding. And I remember that the alternative was genocide, the systematic destruction of thousands of sentient beings because we were too afraid to try understanding them. The Council's way would have been clear, simpler, and wrong. Elena, you taught the galaxy something it desperately needed to learn. That fear is not wisdom. That destruction is not the same as safety. That sometimes the hard path, the complicated path, is the only moral path. Elena nodded slowly, watching Earth rotate below. Somewhere down there, in thousands of labs and construction sites and art studios, humans and rendering were working together, creating things neither could achieve alone. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better than the alternative. 20 years after her initial discovery, Eleanor retired from the Sanctuary Institute. She was 65 years old, gray-haired and tired, but satisfied in a way that few people ever achieved. She'd changed the galaxy, not through force or conquest, but through the simple insistence that understanding was possible. Her retirement was marked by ceremonies on a dozen worlds. Rendering collectives created crystalline sculptures in her honor, structures of breathtaking beauty that would last for millennia. The council awarded her the Star of Peace, its highest civilian honor. Even Ambassador KZZCT, who'd opposed her at every turn, offered grudging respect. "You were reckless," the Zorais said at the awards ceremony. "You endangered everything we'd built over thousands of years. But you were also right, and that is perhaps the most infuriating part of all." Elena smiled. "I'll take it." She retired to a small habitat on Mars, overlooking Valles Marineris. The view was spectacular, all red rocks and ancient canyons carved by water that had flowed billions of years ago. She spent her days writing, documenting everything she'd learned about rendering communication and partnership. But she wasn't alone. In a specially designed chamber adjacent to her habitat, a small rendering collective had taken up residence. It called itself Memory, and it had volunteered to be her companion. They spent hours in conversation, Elena speaking aloud while Memory responded through the interface chamber. They talked about everything: science, philosophy, art, the nature of consciousness itself. Memory had questions about biological existence that Elena had never considered. Elena had questions about crystalline perception that Memory found equally fascinating. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked one day, watching the sunset paint the Martian sky in shades of pink and orange. "Choosing partnership over isolation, you could have stayed in the darkness, untouched, unchanging." Memory's response came as patterns of light that the interface translated into words. "Isolation is a kind of death, slow and certain. Partnership is risk, yes. Risk of rejection, of conflict, of change, but also possibility. I would rather die trying to connect than live forever alone." That's the most human thing I've ever heard a rendering say. Perhaps being human is not about biology. Perhaps it is about the choice to reach across the dark and hope something reaches back. Elena smiled. Perhaps. She lived another 15 years, watching the galaxy continue to transform. More species established rendering partnerships. The technology that resulted revolutionized everything from medicine to construction to space travel. Rendering collectives began contributing to galactic culture, creating art and music and literature in forms that biological species had never imagined. There were still problems, still hostile rendering deposits, still species that refused to accept them, still incidents and conflicts and failures. But the trajectory was clear. The galaxy was learning to coexist with something it had feared for 23,000 years. When Elena died at 80, peacefully in her sleep, the entire galaxy mourned. Memorial services were held on hundreds of worlds. Rendering collectives created structures in her memory that would outlast mountains. The council declared an official day of remembrance. Dr. Chen, now elderly herself, gave the eulogy at Elena's memorial on Luna Station. Elena Vasquez changed everything by refusing to accept what everyone knew was impossible. She looked at the galaxy's greatest fear and asked a simple question: what if we tried to understand it? That question saved billions of lives and transformed our civilization. She taught us that wisdom is not the same as certainty, that courage sometimes means admitting you might be wrong, and that the hardest problems often have the simplest solutions. We just have to be brave enough to try them. Memory, the rendering collective that had been Elena's companion, spoke last. Its words were translated through the interface, but they carried an emotional weight that transcended mere language. Elena Vasquez was the first to listen. Not the first to hear, not the first to observe, but the first to truly listen with the intent to understand rather than categorize or destroy. She heard us calling from the darkness, and she called back. For 23,000 years we waited for that response. We will wait 23,000 more before we forget what she gave us. Hope, understanding, connection. These are not small things. They are everything. Elena's legacy lived on through the Sanctuary Institute, through the thousands of human rendering partnerships, through the transformed council policies, through the changed galaxy, but perhaps most importantly, through the simple idea she'd championed. That understanding was always worth attempting, even when it seemed impossible. 50 years after Elena's death, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. Rendering collectives were full members of galactic society. Mixed teams of biological and crystalline beings worked on projects that neither could accomplish alone. The old quarantine zones had been transformed into partnership hubs, where rendering deposits that had been isolated for millennia were carefully, respectfully contacted and offered choices. Not all accepted. Some remained hostile. Some preferred isolation. But many, so many, chose connection, chose understanding, chose partnership. And somewhere in the archives of the Sanctuary Institute, preserved in multiple formats for future generations, was a recording. Elena Vasquez, young and uncertain, speaking into a log after her first successful communication with the rendering. "I don't know if this will work. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I have to try, because somewhere out there, something has been calling for help for thousands of years. And if there's even a chance we can answer, if there's even a possibility that understanding is achievable, then we have to take it, because that's what it means to be human. Not the technology we build or the worlds we colonize, but the choice, again and again, to reach into the darkness and extend a hand to something that scares us. To say, 'I don't understand you yet, but I want to. Help me understand.' Those words became the unofficial motto of the Sanctuary Institute. They were taught to every student studying xenobiology. They were inscribed on monuments throughout human space. They represented a fundamental shift in how humanity, and eventually the galaxy, approached the unknown. Ambassador Thelm, now ancient by Vroyan standards, visited Elena's memorial on Luna Station one last time before his own retirement. He stood before the statue, a representation of Elena kneeling to offer the interface to a crystalline structure, both figures reaching toward each other. "We called you reckless," he said to the statue. "We called you naive. We said you didn't understand the dangers, the risks, the complexities. We were the ones who didn't understand. You saw clearly what we refused to see, that our fear had become the danger, that our caution had calcified into cowardice, that we'd spent so long protecting ourselves from threats that we'd forgotten how to recognize opportunities." He touched the statue gently. "Thank you for being braver than we were. Thank you for showing us a better way. The galaxy Elena had helped create wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still misunderstandings, still tragedies. But it was a galaxy where the response to fear was understanding rather than destruction, where the unknown was met with curiosity rather than violence, where different forms of existence, biological and crystalline, carbon and silicon, could find common ground. It was a galaxy that had learned, through one human's stubborn refusal to accept impossibility, that transformation was always possible, that even the deepest fears could be understood, that even the longest darkness could be lit by the simple willingness to listen. And somewhere in that vast darkness between stars, on worlds where rendering deposits had waited in isolation for millennia, new connections were being made, new partnerships forming, new understanding dawning. The rendering had called into the void for 23,000 years, hoping someone would answer. Finally, someone had, and the galaxy would never be the same.